Alright, grade 4's next part we're going to look at is the history, and we're specifically, going to be looking at Nelson Mandela and what made him such a good leader, and a little bit more about his life. Well, first of all, we need to know that he was a great leader. He fought against apartheid in South Africa. He went to jail because he stood up for what he believed was right, and he became South Africa's first black president. He was incredibly famous. Everybody around the world knew him, and not just because he was our first black president, but because he was such a good person. Everyone wanted to know him, wanted to be around him, because he was such an awesome man. Now, before we go any further, there's some very interesting words that we need to know about. First of all, is the one that I mentioned was apartheid. And this is basically it was a policy that the government made, rules that the government made, and it was a way of keeping black, coloured and Indian South Africans apart from the white people. Apartheid comes from the Afrikaans word, actually mean to separate, to keep apart. And during apartheid, the old South African government treated white people better than everyone else. So white people were allowed to go onto certain beaches, and coloured and black and Indian people were not. And white people were allowed to ride in the front of the bus, and black people were not. And there were actually signs all over the place saying only for whites, no blacks allowed. And it was incredibly separate and very, very unfair. White people were allowed to travel wherever they wanted to. Black people had to walk around with a pass, and if they didn't have this little pass book saying that they were allowed to be there, they would be in trouble and sometimes just thrown in jail for no other reason other than that they didn't have this little pass book with them. So it was an incredibly unfair set of rules that our government imposed on our country. Now it's apartheid, keeping black, coloured Indian South Africans apart from the white South Africans. Then we have the word protest, and this is an action like a march to show disagreement or unhappiness about something. So if you protest about something, you show some sort of action that you don't like something. And in South Africa during apartheid, and even now, we have many people who protest. They march through town or they march to government, and they show their unhappiness about something. The next word is charter. And this is a written paper that says what everyone should be allowed to do. And the very famous charter that former President Mandela and his friends came up with is what's called the Freedom Charter. And they wrote this while we were still under apartheid, and it was a whole set of rules that they felt should be in place. The fact that everyone should be equal, that nobody should be treated differently just because of colour of their skin, that everyone should have the same rights and should be able to do the same thing. And that was called the Freedom Charter, and it was incredibly powerful and wonderful hope for what South Africa could be. And like I said, this was written before he even became president. And once he became president, they tried very hard to bring all these things that were in the Freedom Charter into being the actual rule of our country. And the last interesting word for this little section is political prisoner. And these are a person who is sent to jail because they stood up for what they believed in. They didn't do an actual crime like we think of today. Like they didn't rob anybody. They didn't steal anything. They didn't hurt anybody. But they disagreed with what the politics of the country were, and they stood up against these politics. They said, no, this is not right. This whole system of apartheid is not right. I disagree with it. They protested against it. And because of that, the government put them in jail because they disagreed with what the government said. That was a political prisoner. Okay, now let's move on a little bit and let's look at his life. Okay, an incredibly great man, lots and lots of history in his life. He was born on the 18th of July, 1918 in Mvezo, which is near Umtata in the Transkei in the Eastern Cape. And he went to school at about 7 years old. It was 1925 in Kuno, in a little village in the Transkei. This was the first time he never wore his traditional Xhosa blanket. He would wear this blanket when he was helping his family look after the livestock. He would go out and look after the sheep and the goats as a young boy. And this was the first time he didn't have his traditional blanket with him. And his dad cut up some long pants and made them into shorts for him to wear to school. And off he went to school. And at school, his teacher couldn't pronounce his Xhosa name properly, so she gave him an English name, and she called him Nelson. That wasn't the name that his parents gave him. And off he went to school and started learning. Then in about 1948, the next quite important thing happened, and this was the start of apartheid. In 1948, South Africans went to a vote, and they voted for a new government. And unfortunately, it wasn't all of South Africans. It was only the white South Africans that were allowed to vote in this elections. And a new government came into power. And this was the start of apartheid. And this new government enforced apartheid in a horrible, horrible way. They were quite vicious in the way that they enforced apartheid. Then we jump over to 1964. And this is jail time on my slides. And he went to jail for standing up for what is right. He was very, very active politically. He stood up and he marched and he organized protests and helped people also protest against this government that was in place that didn't allow everybody in South Africa to have the same rights. And because of this, he went to jail. And he went to jail for a very long time. He was in jail for 27 years. And not for any crime that he committed, just because he disagreed with what the government was doing. Freedom in 1990, he was finally set free after 27 years of being in jail on mostly on Robben Island. And a lot of the reason of why he was set free was the rest of the world was not happy with what South Africa was doing. There was a lot of international pressure. Other countries wanted nothing to do with us. They wouldn't come and play sport against us. So there was no playing sport against Bangladesh or India or Australia. There wasn't any World Cups. We were not allowed to take part in any World Cups because the rest of the world said, no, South Africa, what you're doing is wrong. Apartheid is not right. And eventually in 1990, the government said, no, maybe we need to change. And Nelson Mandela was set free. And it took a little while and policies were changed, but eventually in 1994, on the 27th of April, a day that we now call Freedom Day, all South Africans were allowed to vote. Every single person in South Africa was allowed to go and vote for who they wanted as president. And the ANC came into power, and Nelson Mandela, heading the ANC, became our first black president. The first president to actually represent the whole country, and not just white people of the country. It was a very special day, and as I said, the 27th of April, we've just had it recently, that's Freedom Day. And it's called Freedom Day because all South Africans were free on that day. In 1999, he retired from public life. He'd done a lot of work, and he was very busy and very involved in many different things, even after he stepped down as president. In 2013, we sadly had to say goodbye to Nelson Mandela. He died on the 5th of December. He was 85 years old. And this was a very sad day for South Africa and for the rest of the world, because people from all over the world, celebrities, other presidents, very, very important people from all over came to say goodbye to him. Many people in South Africa called him Tata, which means father, because they saw him as a father figure for South Africa, because he was such a great leader. And some of the things that made him such a great leader was the fact that he listened to people. He didn't just want his way. He listened to what everyone had to say before he made his decision. He also respected others. He could have come out of jail and he could have said, you know what, white people were mean to me, so I'm going to be mean to them. But he didn't. He was forgiving, another good quality of a leader. He was a peacemaker. He stood up for what he believed, even though it put him in prison for 27 years. He never once turned around and said, okay, bad government, apartheid government, I'm just going to believe what you say. No, he kept by his morals, his values. He said, this is the kind of person I want to be and nothing will change it. He also was very generous. He always helped others. And he loved people. He loved to be around people. He communicated well, but he especially loved kids. He started the Nelson Mandela Kids Foundation, and he really, really wanted to help children who didn't have anybody else to look after them. A great man, one that drastically changed our country, and it wasn't just him. Many, many other people fought with him to help bring about our country the way it is now. So there we are, Nelson Mandela's life, a great person, a great leader, definitely a good role model to look up to. Hope you enjoyed. Good luck.